Hello, everybody, and welcome to Rim Dynasty, an NBA history podcast about the 2000s NBA. I'm your supreme leader, Lewis, and today we're going to preview the 1999-2000 NBA season for the Midwest Division. Like with the Pacific Division, I'll do a roster breakdown, how each team did in the lockout-shortened 1999 season, and looking forward to how they may perform in the 99-2000 season. So, what teams are in the Midwest Division? This is another division that has 7 teams in it. They're really stretching the boundaries here of what the Midwest is with the teams in this division. The Midwest Division is made up of my Vancouver Grizzlies, the Denver Nuggets, the Dallas Mavericks, the Minnesota Timberwolves, the Houston Rockets, the Utah Jazz, and the 1999 NBA champions, or world champions, some may say, the San Antonio Spurs. And that is the order that we're going to talk about these teams. Now, for the Pacific Division, I went from first place to 7th place in the division. This episode is going to flow much better from a storytelling perspective if I go from 7th to 1st. So we are going to start in Vancouver and make our way up the standings to San Antonio. Now, once again, I do have a link to a survey in the episode description here. Please take it if you have a minute. It is 6 questions. Most are optional. I've gotten some really good feedback so far, and I'd like some more. I'll probably keep that survey going until the end of the previews. It'll help me make this podcast better. That's going to be good for everybody involved. If you'd rather not fill out a survey, but you want to give me feedback and segment and content suggestions, all my social media links and voicemail number are in the descriptions of this episode. So follow and slide into my DMs if you would like. One question that I have gotten a couple times is, where are the backfired episodes? So I really appreciate how many people liked that podcast and want to listen to it some more. They are on my YouTube channel. I will figure out if I can make a second podcast feed and repost them in there if you want to listen on Spotify or Apple or whatever platform. But I have all the audio files, so I'll just work on that in the next few days. And by the next episode, I'll update you on where you can find that. And by the way, speaking of moving, I'm moving Backfired to another feed. This episode has been mostly written for a very, very long time. I've just been moving into a new house in the past week, and it turns out, this is interesting, you might not know this, turns out if you give yourself 7 days to move, it is going to take 7 days to move. Incredible how that works, but I am finally getting settled. I just unpacked my podcasting equipment 30 minutes ago, and we are ready to go. So let's get started with my Vancouver Grizzlies, coached by Brian Hill in his 3rd season as the head coach of the Vancouver Grizzlies, formerly the head coach of the Orlando Magic, helped lead them to the NBA Finals in 1995, where they lost to the Houston Rockets. Now, the Grizzlies are entering just their 5th season in the league. So how were they able to get a coach with such pedigree? Expansion teams usually have to dig through the scrap heap or hire assistant coaches to get a head coach, even 5 years in. Well, he was let go by the Orlando Magic midway through the 1997 season. The first season in the post-Shaq era where the Magic's players just kind of revolted against Hill. They didn't like his coaching style anymore. He was getting a little too intense in practice, screaming a little too much. One of the most important things, he was clashing with Penny Hardaway. He spearheaded the campaign to get Hill fired. But most importantly, I'd say the team was losing. Hill was fired when the Magic fell to 24-25 on the season, and that was after the team had gone 3 consecutive years winning 50 or more games and actually winning 60 in one season. So Shaq's absence aside, Hill just was not getting the job done anymore, and the players wanted to move a different direction. But for the Vancouver Grizzlies, they just needed a coach who had been there before, who had taken a recent expansion team to great heights, and all that the Grizzlies were trying to do, ideally, was make the playoffs, but at minimum they were just trying to win 30 games. So Hill being on the market at the time was a great option for them. So I mentioned potential win total. The Grizzlies had won a total of 56 games across 4 seasons out of a possible 296. That is 19%. That'd be about a 15 to 16 win pace over the course of an 82 game season. So it should come as no surprise to you that they won 15 games in their first season, 14 in their second season, 19 in their third season, and then in the lockout-shortened 1999 season, they were the worst team in the league. They finished with an 8-42 record. They were 28th in offense and 27th in defense. As somebody who has watched a lot of Vancouver Grizzlies games, it is impossible to say which end of the ball they're worse on. That 8-42 record, by the way, would be about 13 wins over the course of a full season. So they did worse in their fourth season than they had in any of the first three. And it's typical for expansion teams to be bad, but to be this bad still is a little bit shocking, especially considering how well the Toronto Raptors are doing, despite facing, a lot of the same challenges that the Grizzlies did, including restrictions on player salaries and draft picks and the tax situation up in Canada, which is a little overblown. So who is on the Vancouver Grizzlies? What is so bad about this team that they've been the worst team in the league for 4 years in a row? So at point guard, they've got Mike Bibby. He just finished up his rookie season in Vancouver, started all 50 games, averaged just over 13 points, 6.5 assists, average or just below league average in all the shooting splits. Not a bad rookie season, all things considered. He averaged the most assists for a rookie that season. He was the second overall pick in the 1998 draft out of Arizona. They won the NCAA championship in 1997. And Bibby was the odds-on number one pick for the vast majority of the draft process until Elgin Baylor and the Clippers took another look at Michael Olowokandi. That turned out to actually be a good thing for the Vancouver Grizzlies, who needed a point guard. They had whiffed on their fourth pick in 1997 by taking Antonio Daniels. They moved him to the San Antonio Spurs after a disappointing rookie season. Listen on for who won that trade. Starting alongside Bibby at the 2 late in the season was Felipe Lopez. He was also a rookie. He was taken 24th overall in 98 with the Spurs first round pick, traded to Vancouver for Antonio Daniels. He had an okay rookie season as well, about 9 points a game. Didn't shoot very many threes, but was moderately efficient. He was referred to as the Dominican Michael Jordan for his whole high school career. Thought about entering the NBA draft right out of high school. Decided to go to St. John's instead. When he committed, he was on the cover of Sports Illustrated, and they declared that the Big East was back. And that was a huge deal, by the way, for him to be on the cover of Sports Illustrated as a high schooler. He was one of the single most hyped high schoolers ever. Bleacher Report article calls him LeBron before LeBron, and that pretty well captures the amount of hype that he had. Now, after a great freshman season at St. John's, where he did live up to that hype, he then completely overstayed his welcome at St. John's, and his draft stock just dropped a little bit season by season until he had stayed all 4 years at St. John's, when 1 year would have sufficed, 0 years would have sufficed, to be honest. But his rookie season was not bad, all things considered. He earned, the starting role toward the end of the season. He was replacing the traded Sam Mack, who was demanding a new contract, did not get it, and was eventually traded to the Houston Rockets in the middle of the 99 season. At the small forward, one of my favorite players of all time, Sharif Abdur-Rahim, one of the smoothest and most overlooked power forwards of the 2000s, mostly because he was just on crappy teams his entire career. But he also started all 50 games in his third season, averaged 23 points per game, 7.5 rebounds, 3.5 assists, 2.5 stocks, got double teamed every time down the floor, basically, and was blocked more times than anybody else in the NBA in 1999. I had forgotten that they keep track of that kind of thing. But in 50 games, he was blocked 106 times. Second place in that illustrious stat was Keith Van Horn. He was only blocked 89 times. So very unfortunate for Sharif that he had somebody, or multiple somebodies on him at all times. But he was still able to be the league's fourth leading scorer behind Karl Malone, Shaq, and Allen Iverson despite that. And Sharif took a really big leap of faith by signing a contract extension with the Grizzlies right before the 99 season began, instead of taking things to unrestricted free agency just a few months later, where the Chicago Bulls were waiting to offer him a huge contract. So he's locked down in Vancouver for the foreseeable future, but he's getting a little bit antsy with all the losing, and something else that I'm going to talk about in a few minutes. At the power forward, it kind of depended on the day. Mostly, it was Tony Massenberg, who is a journeyman, elite hoop grids pull. He's played for 12 teams, just a warm body for the Grizzlies to roll out. He was fine. But he split time at the 4 with a guy named Cherokee Parks, who was kind of the spiritual successor almost to Christian Laettner at Duke as the big white center who scored a lot of points. But Duke with Cherokee Parks as kind of like the focal point of the team, especially his senior season, was not very successful. He did become a lottery pick, even on the one really bad Duke team from the 1990s, but he was a good mid-range and three-point shooter in college, fantastic mid-range shooter early in his NBA career. Unfortunately, the very first season that he was not good at shooting along to was the 1999 season after the Vancouver Grizzlies used their mid-level exception for him. One other kind of interesting thing about Cherokee Parks, he was in contention to be drafted with, I can't remember, I think it was the 9th pick by Detroit in 95, and his college teammate, Grant Hill, told the Detroit Pistons front office, you don't want to draft this guy, he is too much of a party animal. And they said, well, hey, if anybody knows, it's going to be you, Grant. So they passed on him. He went to Dallas with the 12th pick. And we'll talk about that more in a little bit as well when we get to the Dallas section. But Cherokee Parks actually filled in at center sometimes as well when Bryant Big Country Reeves sustained an injury and missed the final 25 games of the 99 season. Big Country, for those who don't know, center out of Oklahoma State, who was just an absolute monster in college and in his second and third seasons in the NBA. But unfortunately, he struggled a lot with conditioning and his weight because he never played basketball in the summer. And so he would have these really slow starts to the season. And then once he was back in playing shape, he would be really, really good. As an analogy, he's very much like a Slacking or like a Reggie Gigas type of player, if you want to think about it in Pokemon terms. But before the 99 season, when nobody knew when or if the league was going to return during the lockout, he just relaxed and tended to his cattle farm back in Oklahoma, gained a bunch of weight. And when he returned, he was not very effective and then got an injury that was related to his lack of conditioning. But he's come into training camp as light as ever and is ready to contribute at a high level right off the bat for the first time in a long time. Then off the bench, they had a couple of other guys who played semi-consistently. There's Michael Smith, who's a great rebounder. Doug West, who was a very sad story. He battled alcoholism throughout his entire NBA career, mostly with the Timberwolves. And then once he got sober, struggled with injuries. So just bad all around. And then there's also Pete Chilcutt, who was an NBA champion with the Houston Rockets. He's another big white guy who could shoot pretty well. But so the Grizzlies have got 2.5, let's say, good players and a good coach. But with Bryant Reeves completely ineffective and then out for the second half of the season, and then the craziness of the shortened season where people were playing like 5 games in 6 nights, back-to-back-to-backs, the Grizzlies were only able to muster 8 wins, and in their final 40 games, just 4 wins. So they had a lot of room to get better. What did they do to try to get better? With the fewest amount of wins in the league, surely they added a high draft pick to the fold that would help power them, to unseen heights in Vancouver. Surely that's the case, right? Well, they won the 2nd pick in the draft. They toyed around with the idea of picking Lamar Odom, who I talked about in the last episode, the Clippers preview. He's a super versatile power forward. He would have fit perfectly with the Grizzlies. He wanted to be drafted by them. He watched a bunch of Grizzlies games on TV when he was in college. He thought he would play well with Bibby and with Sharif and with Big Country. But the Grizzlies did not pick him. They picked Steve Francis, who explicitly told Grizzlies general manager Stu Jackson, who he's a good guy, don't get me wrong, but he's one of the single worst basketball team executives of all time. That's a discussion for another day. Francis told Stu Jackson, he's not going to play for the Grizzlies. Don't draft me. You're wasting a pick. I'll literally sit out the entire year and enter the next draft, or I'll go to Italy. Don't pick me. And Stu Jackson was like, I can convince him. He's all bluster, whatever. So that backfired on Stu Jackson immediately. Hey, that's the name of my old podcast, huh? But the bottom line is that Francis was extremely unhappy, did not want to go to Vancouver, didn't know where Vancouver was exactly, just knew that it was far away from his hometown, which was a suburb of Washington, D.C. up in Maryland, far from his grandmother, so he wasn't going to go. He did visit town a couple of times, actually got to understand the team dynamic, but then doubled down on wanting a trade because he wanted to be a point guard. The Grizzlies wanted to play him at shooting guard alongside Bibby. That was not going to work for old Stevie franchise. So long story short, he held out, eventually got traded to the Houston Rockets. So he was traded in a 3-team deal that also involved the Orlando Magic. A lot of trades involving the Orlando Magic this year. Once I get to the Magic, you'll understand the vision. So Vancouver sent out Steve Francis, Tony Massenberg, Lee Mayberry, who is a point guard whose career was over, Mokhtar Njai, he's the first Senegalese player in NBA history, Roderick Rhodes, who's a young wing, and then Michael Smith, who's the bench rebounder that I mentioned. Vancouver sent them out to Houston and Orlando, received back Michael Dickerson. He's a slashing wing who plays excellent defense. He's a knockdown shooter. Started all 50 games for the Rockets as a rookie, alongside Charles Barkley, Scottie Pippen, Hakeem Olajuwon. I guess spoiler alert on that because the Rockets are coming up soon. But Dickerson is really good. He also played at Arizona with Mike Bibby. They won the 97 title together. So they're excited to play together again and emulate some of the success that they had down in Tucson, up in Vancouver. Othello Harrington, he's a power forward from Georgetown who's gotten better in each of his 3 seasons in the NBA. He did very well in his 10 starts in 1999, about 14 points, 8 rebounds per game in that time. So although the Rockets only went 4-6 in the games that he started, the Grizzlies feel like he's probably ready for a bigger role. Othello Harrington, I can't stress this enough, fucking hates Vancouver. He hates Vancouver so much. And I kind of get it. He's from Mississippi. He's played in Houston the first few years of his career. I guess he likes the hot weather. He's not prepared for the cold and the rain. He actually went up to Vancouver to do a pre-draft workout, and he was told, oh, it's like going to Siberia up there. And so he gets off the plane in the middle of the summer wearing like a fur-lined parka. And of course, it's like 65 degrees or something. Like it's so pleasant up there in the summer. But he just has no idea, and he doesn't want to, experience the winter. So he is not happy about having been traded to Vancouver. And that is going to manifest itself during this season, so look out for that. Brent Price, he's a point guard. He's the brother of Cavaliers legend Mark Price. Antoine Carr, he's a 6'9" big man. He's all energy all the time. He's a big hustle guy. And then Vancouver also got a couple of draft picks. So all in all, not the worst value for Vancouver. They actually filled multiple positions of need with this trade instead of just having 2 point guards and no shooting guard and no power forward. But it was just a completely unforced error that really weakened the Grizzlies in a time where they were already pretty weak. And so what do I mean by that? Well, after his bid to purchase the Denver Nuggets fell through, there's this guy named Bill Laurie. He played point guard at Memphis State University in the 70s. He is the husband of an heiress to the Walmart fortune, and he's also the owner of the St. Louis Blues. He bought the Grizzlies and is not so secretly planning to relocate the team from Vancouver to St. Louis. We're going to talk about that a lot over the course of the season, not just because it's Vancouver related, but because it's one of the major stories happening in the league this year. Laurie's plan is to relocate the team in the summer of 2001, so that is fast approaching. One thing that's interesting that I alluded to earlier, Sharif Abdur-Rahim does not want to go to St. Louis. It's not against St. Louis. It's that he doesn't want to be on a team that relocates because he knows that if the team relocates, it's going to be 6 more years of shit. And so he has made it known, if the team moves cities, you need to trade me. So even though he just signed an extension, that's weighing on the franchise. And one more note on Bill Laurie. He is the brother-in-law of Stan Kroenke, who is no stranger to relocating teams to St. Louis. He took the LA Rams to St. Louis and then, of course, eventually took the St. Louis Rams to LA. But he's also the owner of my favorite soccer club, Arsenal. That's right, I'm a Gooner. But we are going to hear a little bit more about Stan Kroenke this season as well, because he's eventually going to become the owner of the Denver Nuggets. So anyway, with the Francis trade becoming consummated and a couple of promising free agent acquisitions, you got Grant Long. He figures to be a major contributor at power forward once he's healthy. He's a veteran, good defender. And then there's Dennis Scott, who played for Brian Hill in Orlando. Here is what the Grizzlies lineup is projected to look like. Mike Bibby, Michael Dickerson, Sharif Abdur-Rahim, Othello Harrington, Bryant Reeves in the starting lineup. And then off the bench, this isn't going to happen, but Brent Price at a backup point guard, Felipe Lopez at the 2, and then in the front court, some amalgam of like Grant Long, Antoine Carr, Cherokee Parks. Is that going to be enough to make the playoffs? Absolutely not. Is it going to be enough to win 30 games? It's possible. Maybe, maybe not. Their over-under win total is set at 25.5, which is tied with the Clippers for being the lowest mark in the league. But is this the best that the team has ever been? Shockingly, yes, it is. And if the fans in Vancouver want their team to stick around and not relocate to St. Louis, that is going to have to be good enough for them. They got to buy some tickets, some merchandise, and some overpriced sodas down there at GM Place. Moving on to the Denver Nuggets, they're going to be coached by Dan Issel, one of the great big men in NBA and ABA history, 12th all-time leading scorer in the two leagues combined, second all-time in the ABA, a Kentucky Wildcat. He is Kentucky's all-time leading scorer and rebounder, 1975 ABA champion with the Kentucky Colonels, also played for the Denver Rockets and the Denver Nuggets. He's in his second go-round as the head coach of the Nuggets now. He was the president and the general manager, but gave that job to Kiki Vandeweghe and then became the head coach. His first time around did not go very well. He was actually fired midway through his third season, did help engineer the 8-seed Denver Nuggets upsetting the first seed Seattle Supersonics in 1994. So that is definitely an achievement. In 1999, though, there was not a lot of achieving going on in Denver. They were 12th in offense, dead last in defense, 14-36 on the season. Their head coach, Mike D'Antoni, fired after his first season as a head coach in the NBA. I cannot say that it's necessarily his fault that the team was bad in 99 because the Nuggets are one of the worst teams of the 1990s. Outside of 2 playoff appearances in 94 and 95, they were not even sniffing the playoffs most of the other years. But that looked like it could be changing soon, not only because of the players that they have on the team already, but because of a big move that they made in the summer. The good players already on the team are Antonio McDyess, Chauncey Billups, Rafe LaFrentz, and Nick Van Exel. So McDyess, I'm going to talk a lot about McDyess real quick. He's really interesting to me. So he's a 6'9", mostly power forward, generally just a big man. He was drafted by the Clippers with the second pick in the 95 draft out of Alabama. The Clippers in 95, they had in their heads Elgin Baylor and Donald Sterling. They were like, we want to make the playoffs. We haven't made the playoffs in forever. So they traded McDyess, who was a really, really highly touted prospect. I mean, he was the number 2 pick. They traded him to Denver for a guy named Rodney Rogers, who's a fine player, but he's no Antonio McDyess. I'll just say that. Now, to the Clippers' credit, not that season, but the next season, they did actually make the playoffs. They were swept in the first round by the Utah Jazz, but they got that one single game of playoff revenue, so I guess that's nice for them. Meanwhile, Antonio McDyess was all rookie, averaged 18 points, 7 rebounds, 2.5 stocks in his second season. I don't know. I feel like that's a good guy to keep. But the Nuggets actually traded Antonio McDyess to the Phoenix Suns after his second season because they couldn't agree on a contract extension. And then after one single season in Phoenix, Antonio McDyess was a free agent and he re-signed with the Denver Nuggets. And so a bunch of Suns players, you got Jason Kidd, Rex Chapman, a few others, they flew from Phoenix to Denver, tried to land in Denver during obviously they weren't flying the plane, but the pilot of the plane tried to land in Denver during a blizzard. It took a long time. So they could make their way to the hockey arena where Antonio McDyess and Dan Issel were watching a Colorado Avalanche playoff game together. They wanted to, make a pitch to him to re-sign with the Suns. Dan Issel told the arena security, do not let these guys in and they were turned away at the door, and McDyess re-signed with the Nuggets instead of going back to the Suns. So some strategery going on there to reacquire McDyess for the Nuggets. And McDyess in the lockout shortened 99 season had 21 points, 11 rebounds, about 4 stocks per game. So I mean, the Nuggets, for going one season without McDyess, they got 3 first-round picks and 2 second-round picks from the Suns, and then they just got their guy back. So that is incredible to me. Also on the team is Chauncey Billups. We all know about him. At this point, he's a really underrated and solid young guard. He's already on his 3rd team. Both the Celtics and the Raptors gave up on him after half of a season. But he's been the starting shooting guard on Denver the past year, and he just finished up his 2nd season in the league. Averaged about 14 points per game, 4 assists. He is at the 2, even though we think of him traditionally as a point guard, I would say. At least I do. But the Nuggets starting point guard is Nick Van Exel of Lakers fame, and he just finished up his 1st season in Denver as well. Started all 50 games for the Nuggets. Rafe LaFrentz is also on the team. He's a rookie stretch 5 out of Kansas who really looked like he was going to have a great rookie season, but 12 games into the season tore his ACL. As a rookie, and I'm excluding the game where he got injured 4 minutes into the game, he averaged 15 points, 8 rebounds, about a block and a half, was shooting 40% from 3 on good volume. So, I mean, that for the Nuggets was a huge loss. It's not the only reason that the Nuggets missed the playoffs and only won 14 games, but having like a stud rookie miss 3/4 of the season certainly does not help. But LaFrentz draws a lot of Bill Laimbeer comparisons early in his career because he's mobile, he can shoot, he can rebound well. So those are the 4 probably best players on the Nuggets in 99. And I mentioned that they added a 5th good player. And that 5th good player is Ron Mercer, who had just wrapped up his 2nd season in the league. A lot of really young players on Denver right now. He was another 97 first-round pick by the Boston Celtics, just like Chauncey Billups, who found himself in Denver eventually. Boston is not a great team right now, but they're a little bit better than Denver. So, maybe Ron Mercer's stats are going to mean a little more to you if you take putting up good numbers on a bad team with a grain of salt, which is understandable. In his 2nd season, Mercer was putting up about 17 points, 4 rebounds, 2.5 assists, and he was the starting shooting guard for the Rick Pitino Celtics. Now, Mercer had played for Pitino in college at Kentucky, and so he was a little bit upset with Pitino because from his perspective, Pitino had not given him a real shot to show what he could do in the NBA. The Celtics had drafted Paul Pierce the season after Mercer, and he kind of operated in the same space a lot of the time as Mercer and was much, much better than Mercer. Like, Mercer's good, but it's Paul Pierce. But that is the downside, to be honest, of the short rookie scale contracts that the NBA used to have, which was 3 seasons, extension eligible after 2 seasons, and then unrestricted free agency. A team had to decide after basically 2 seasons if they wanted to give somebody like 6 years, $100 million or something like that, or just trade him away because you don't want to lose him for nothing. So it was bad for the team and for the players, in my opinion. But on the flip side, the guys who are really good or promising early in their career, they got a huge payday a lot sooner than free agency and extensions come up nowadays. So there's a lot to consider there about the length of rookie scale contracts. But the Celtics sent Mercer to Denver, which is a team who did not want to give him an extension sight unseen. They wanted to see how he played with his new teammates, which is understandable. There were at least 6 suitors, according to Sports Illustrated, including the Miami Heat, who were willing to extend him on the spot if they landed him in a trade. Denver wanted to see how he did for a year and then offer him a contract or just let him walk when he was an unrestricted free agent the next summer. And Mercer clarifies that he is renting, not buying in Denver for the time being. So he's not too optimistic about how things are going to go. One funny thing, though, in Sports Illustrated, it mentions that he searched up the Denver Nuggets roster on the internet to find out who he was going to be playing with. And, he looked at the roster and saw like, oh shit, I get to play with Chauncey Billups again. But so Pitino and the Celtics, they did not want to lose Mercer for nothing the following summer. They knew that he was like valuable, but just not to them at that current time because of Paul Pierce, essentially. So they sent Mercer, Popeye Jones, who's a veteran power forward, and then Dwayne Shintzis, whose career was over by that time, to Denver, got back Danny Fortson, Eric Williams, Eric Washington, and a first-round pick. Now, Fortson's a loss. He was pretty good. Eric Williams was out of the league at that point, but Eric Washington's kind of an interesting situation. The Nuggets actually got him from the Celtics in the first place. 4 games into his Nuggets tenure, he tore his ACL. So easy come, easy go. But the Nuggets, despite Mercer's pessimism, are pretty excited to have him in the building. They like his ability to slash, drive to the rim, handling. They like his defense. They're excited to add him into their talented young core of players. And they really need him to be good because as much as I've been gassing up this group of players on the court, they're not very good. Like, I like each of these pieces individually. So far, they're not really meshing. But they also added George McLeod from Phoenix. So he is reunited with McDyess. McLeod is a little bit older, but at one time he was one of the best three-point shooters in the NBA. In 96, so take it with a grain of salt if you want, that is during the shortened three-point line era, but McLeod shot 38% on 8.5 attempts per game and was second in the league and at the time NBA history for most three-pointers made in a season. So he's a great get even with a longer three-point line. And then they drafted James Posey out of Xavier with their number 18 pick. So McLeod and Posey are the Nuggets' small forwards of note. And then the last guy I wanted to mention was Bryant Stith. He's a solid shooting guard. He's entering his 8th season in the NBA, all with the Nuggets. And he's logged a lot of minutes for the Nuggets. Has kind of fallen off in recent years. So we'll see if he plays a big role on the team this season. But so that is going to make their starting lineup, in theory, Nick Van Exel at the 1, Chauncey Billups at the 2, Ron Mercer at the 3, Antonio McDyess at the 4, and then Rafe LaFrentz in the middle. Coming off the bench, George McLeod, James Posey, and Bryant Stith. But I will mention this, Chauncey Billups is going to miss the start of the season with an ankle sprain. So to start off, it's going to be Mercer at the 2 and James Posey at the 3. Off the court, the Nuggets are opening up a new arena. It's called the Pepsi Center. And then something else to watch. So I mentioned Stan Kroenke and Bill Lowry in the Grizzlies section. The new owner of the Nuggets for now is this guy named Donald Sturm, who bought the team after this weird situation where Bill Lowry, the presumptive owner of the Grizzlies, and the outgoing president of Ascent Sports and Entertainment, which was the company that owned like the Avalanche and the Nuggets, is a guy named Charlie Lyons. They had a sweetheart deal that was struck down in court when the Ascent investors didn't like the sale price between the two parties. It was like $100 million discount probably that Lowry was going to get in exchange for making Charlie Lyons, like I think the president maybe of the resulting company. But so the team was actually auctioned off. It was a 2-party auction between Sturm and the Lowry family. The Lowry family failed to submit a bid, so Sturm won it. That is not the end of the story. So we'll hear more about that throughout the season. But the Nuggets over-under win total is set at 31.5, so they're not expected to be very good. But with so much talent, it is kind of hard not to talk yourself into the potential of this team if some things break right. So will they? We're going to have to see. I mentioned the Nuggets were one of the worst teams of the 90s. Neck and neck with them are the Dallas Mavericks. In a horse racing analogy, it's a photo finish. They both suck. The Mavericks have been awful since 1990. Their best win total was in 1995 when they won 36 games. Now in 95, they had a pretty solid core of guys. I mean, there's some names on this roster. Jason Kidd, Jamal Mashburn, Jim Jackson, George McLeod. But they just really haven't been very good since their first core group of players, which they kind of lucked into in the first place. So the Mavs came into the league ahead of the 1981 season, and they had a major head start in roster building because they were on the receiving end of this guy named Ted Stepien. You may have heard of his rule. Ted Stepien was the owner of the Cleveland Cavaliers, a horrible decision maker, and he wound up sending 4 unprotected first-round picks to the Mavericks for like random players that the Mavericks got in the expansion draft. That like you could have gotten these guys for like a 2nd-round pick, a 5th-round pick, something like that. But he was sending 1st-round picks. These picks turned out to be number 11 in 1983. That was Derek Harper. You may know him more from the Knicks of the 90s than the Mavericks of the 80s. So 11 in 83, number 4 in 1984. The Mavericks used that for Sam Perkins. He's one of the premier stretch bigs of the 90s. He won the 82 championship alongside Michael Jordan at North Carolina. In 1985, the Mavericks got the 8th pick from Cleveland. That was Detlef Schrempf. We've talked about him already. And then in 86, they got number 7 from Cleveland, and that turned into Roy Tarpley. He's a great, very talented center, but his career was destroyed by drug abuse and alcoholism, and I did a Backfired episode about him. It's a very sad story. Also in that core of players, not a result of the Cavs sending them a pick, but the Mavs won the number 1 pick in 1981 and drafted Mark Aguirre. With all of that, the Mavs won their first playoff series in just their 4th season in the league, which is super rare for an expansion team. But anyway, let me talk about the current season now. So they are coached by Don Nelson, aka Nelly. Not that Nelly. At one time, he was the winningest coach in the NBA. He's also the lead executive of the Mavericks. He's very creative when it comes to the center position. He's one of the pioneers of small ball. Doesn't often use a center at all, or does odd things with them. For example, he encouraged the 7'7" Manute Bol to shoot threes. Loves to keep the pace up. The Mavericks currently are not a high-paced team, but that's going to change in the coming years. When Nelly was coaching the Golden State Warriors, especially in the Run TMC era, Mitch Richmond, Tim Hardaway, and Chris Mullin, they were super fast. Like, the only time when Don Nelson was coaching the Warriors from the late 80s to mid-90s that they weren't first or second in pace, they were 5th. So he likes a fast team. He's an innovator, 3-time coach of the year, 5-time champion as a player with the Celtics. Just one of the single most accomplished people in NBA history. Could be a little difficult to work with at times. He was known as a player's coach, but had occasional feuds with players, most notably Chris Webber, who opted out of his rookie contract after a single season in Golden State and forced a trade to the Washington Bullets. But Nelson was only passed by Greg Popovich for most wins in NBA history within the last couple of years. At this point in 1999, his legend is still growing. But for right now, his team is just not very good. As I mentioned, since that first core of great players on the Mavs, they have been in the basement of the NBA. In 99, they were 15th in offense, 25th in defense, 19 and 31 on the season. So how do you get out of the basement of the league? One way, just like they did in the early 80s, is to, get a good player with a draft pick. For the most part, things have not worked out very well on the draft front for Dallas this time around, though, in part because they've never really gotten a high enough pick to do very much. But there is one notable exception to that within the last 5 years. So in the last 5 years, they picked 12th. In 1995, they picked Cherokee Parks. They traded him after one season in exchange for changing the protections on a pick that the Mavs held that belonged to the Timberwolves. They were trying to trade up to the 6th pick to draft Bryant Reeves in 1995. They were going to give Cherokee Parks, who was the 12th pick, plus a 1996 first rounder, but the Grizzlies said, no, we want Big Country. 96, they picked 9th. And they picked Samaki Walker. We'll hear a little bit more about him in a minute. This was actually the Celtics pick. The Mavs pick was 6th, which the Celtics used for Antoine Walker. He was pretty good. In 97, the Mavs picked 15th. That was the Timberwolves pick. They picked Kelvin Cato, immediately traded him to Portland for nothing of value. Their pick was the 6th pick, which the Celtics used for Ron Mercer. Again, pretty good. In 1998, they had the 6th pick. They drafted Robert Traylor from the University of Michigan, but they traded down and got Dirk Nowitzki. This is obviously the one draft pick that actually panned out for the Mavericks in this stretch. Now, I want to do a little experiment here. If you're somebody who's never heard of Dirk Nowitzki, I want you to picture a 7-foot-tall German guy. You got it? Okay, now make him really, really good at basketball. That's kind of what Dirk Nowitzki is like. And then in the 99 draft, the Mavs actually did not have their own first-round pick. They traded that for Steve Nash, who is a Canadian point guard from the Phoenix Suns. The Mavs pick was the 9th pick. That became Sean Marion for the Phoenix Suns. The Mavs did draft a guy named Wang Zhizhi in the 2nd round. China is not going to let him come over just yet. And then the Mavs actually did get the 29th pick from the Spurs, a guy named Leon Smith. He stormed out of training camp, so he just might not be on the team. Who knows? So draft picks not really working out for the Mavericks as of late. Obviously, Dirk is an exception. But you could always sign a player, right? But the Mavs, as is the case nowadays as well, they don't really attract too many free agents. So what about a trade? Well, the Mavs' big move of the offseason, and the only one of note, is that they traded, as I like to call him, famous virgin AC Green to the Lakers for Sean Rooks. AC Green is more famous, obviously, for being like the NBA Iron Man, but he was also famously saving himself for marriage. He's a rock-solid defender, rebounder, two-time champion with the Lakers in 87 and 88, and in fact was such a great defender that he defended his virginity while being a member of the Showtime Lakers. How about that? That should show you how disciplined this guy is, by the way. But the Mavs' only other trade was moving this guy named Chris Anstey, who's an Australian center. They traded him to the Bulls for a second-round pick. So Sean Rooks is basically their big acquisition of the offseason, and he used to be pretty good for the Mavs. That was in the early 90s. Since then, he's bounced around and his playing time and production have dwindled essentially every season. So it's not a great haul for the offseason. So here are the major players for the Mavs in 1999. You got Michael Finley. He's a 20-point-per-game scoring wing. He gets way more assists than I would have thought, about 4.5 per game in 99. You got Steve Nash. We're still kind of waiting on him to blossom. I'll talk about something in a minute that is a good sign. He's going to be 25 this season. He's coming off a season averaging 8 points, 5.5 assists. Really bad shooting percentage, only 35.5% on two-pointers in 99. He's being labeled as a bust, so we're going to see if he turns that around this season. Gary Trent, he's a power forward coming off a season averaging 16 points, 8 rebounds. Pretty good. Hubert Davis, he is a combo guard. He's been shooting lights out from three since he arrived in Dallas. About 44.5% from three on 3 attempts per game in the 98 and 99 seasons combined. Cedric Ceballos, who's a talented but extremely conceited small forward who had a wrist injury in 99 that held him to just 13 games. Sean Bradley, also known as the Stormin' Mormon. He's a 7'6" center. Not a fantastic offensive player, but shockingly, you might be surprised to find this out, he can rebound and he can block shots. Dirk Nowitzki, he had a pretty bad start to his rookie season. He was tired from having just wrapped up the season in Germany. He got very little rest in between, and he was playing power forward in the NBA for the first time. That was hard for him. But he really turned it on down the stretch. In the final 14 games of his rookie season, he averaged about 13.5 points, 5 rebounds per game. Did not shoot very well from the field, but it was consistent starts and minutes and putting the ball in the basket. And the Mavs had an 8-6 record in their last 14 games. And Dirk has done some weight training over the summer, so he's going to be a little more acclimated to the NBA this season than he was before. And then there's a guy named Eric Strickland. He played college basketball at Nebraska, also played minor league baseball while he was in college in the Florida Marlins farm system, but he stopped to pursue basketball instead. Pretty good choice because he played 9 seasons in the NBA as a combo guard. So every one of those guys that I just mentioned is returning. The other guys, AC Green, Chris Anstey, and Samaki Walker, each of whom played a good amount in 99, but they're gone. So they're returning a lot of players. They lost a couple of bench contributors and they're starting power forward. They get back Sean Rooks, and that's about it. I have a joke that I want to make, but it requires a little bit of backstory, so bear with me here. Okay, Ross Perot. You know Ross Perot? He's a presidential candidate in 92 and 96. He won 19% of the popular vote as an independent in 92. Big part of why George H.W. Bush was a one-term president. Perot did not win a single electoral vote, but Bill Clinton certainly benefited from Perot staying in the race as long as he did. His son, Ross Perot Jr., owns the Dallas Mavericks. NAFTA, that is a trade agreement between the United States, Canada, and Mexico. Got rid of a lot of tariffs between the 3 countries. It makes North America what's known as a free trade zone. Ross Perot, when he was running for president, he opposed NAFTA. He said it would lead to American jobs and American wages being outsourced to Mexico. Said there would be a giant sucking sound going south. That would be money going from the United States to Mexico. He said that Mexico was going to be the main one to benefit from the agreement, much more than Canada and much, much more than the U.S. Now that we have all that backstory established, let me start this again. So the Mavs, they lost some rotation players and they're starting power forward, and they only got Sean Rooks back. So it seems like the giant sucking sound is actually coming from Reunion Arena, the home of the Dallas Mavericks. Anyway, moving on from that, the Mavericks needed to get better. They added no quality players this offseason. Is every single thing going badly for the Dallas Mavericks, though? No. As I mentioned, Dirk Nowitzki showed that he could be a great player sooner than later. Steve Nash has played better in the past than he did this past season, so there's hope that he'll improve. Also, I should mention, part of the reason that he played badly was because he was struggling with lower back pain and plantar fasciitis, so it's not like he just forgot how to play basketball. And also, in the summer of 1999, Nash won MVP of the Tournament of the Americas. Despite losing in the finals to the United States, he also qualified Canada for the 2000 Olympics in Sydney, Australia. He was the only NBA player on Team Canada. There is a guy named Todd McCullough. He's a big who played at the University of Washington. He was drafted in 1999, but Steve Nash was the only active current NBA player. Also on the team, Rowan Barrett, RJ Barrett's dad. But the Mavs had signed Nash to a big extension in the summer, so even though some people believe that Nash is a bust, they've given up on Steve Nash. With hindsight, obviously, we know that the best is yet to come for Steve Nash. Some other good things, the Mavs had their first home winning season since 1990. They were 15-10 at home, 4-21 on the road. They re-signed Gary Trent to a steal of a contract. The Seattle Supersonics had offered Gary Trent $4 million a year over 3 years. He re-signed with Dallas for $2.1 million per year, 2 years. Less money, shorter contract. Why do you do that? There was some stuff going on behind the scenes. The Mavs were actually fined $25,000 for their process in this because their recruiting trip for Trent was like an all expenses paid family vacation to Hawaii. And that made up for some of the difference in the salary between the Mavs and the Sonics, I'm sure. And by the way, I'm sorry to break the news. I checked. His son, Gary Trent Jr., of Toronto Raptors fame, he was born in January of 1999. This trip was in the summer of 1999, so I'm sorry. Gary Trent Jr. was not conceived on the tampering vacation in Hawaii. I'm as disappointed as you are. But unfortunately, Gary Trent is going to miss the start of the season with a hamstring tear. And the Mavs, who historically play really poorly on the road, they start with a lot of road games, so odds are that they're going to have a slow start to the season. But hey, maybe they'll be like a Reggie Gigas type team. So we're going to check out on them. I don't have very many Mavs games in my collection as it stands, but we are going to cover them. I might buy some more, who knows. Their over-under win total, by the way, is set at 30.5. So Vegas is not high on this team, but this is going to be one of the last seasons that people can count out Steve Nash and Dirk Nowitzki in the preseason and not look like an absolute moron at the end of the year. The Minnesota Timberwolves. Awoo! They are coached by Flip Saunders, R.I.P. Flip, a Minnesota Golden Gopher, just like his buddy Kevin McHale of Celtics fame. McHale is the vice president of basketball operations for the Minnesota Timberwolves. Saunders was named the general manager of the Timberwolves in May of 95. In December, was named head coach of the Timberwolves. In his first full season as the head coach of the Wolves, Flip led them to the playoffs for the first time in franchise history. They had been Grizzlies level awful for the first 7 years of their miserable existence, but they are on a 3-season streak of making the playoffs. Have not won a playoff series just yet, but it's looking like that could change soon. I'll get to that in a minute. Kevin McHale was thinking about leaving the Timberwolves and the basketball industry as a whole when all-star forward Tom Gugliotta left money on the table to leave the Wolves for the Phoenix Suns after telling McHale that he was interested in returning. He just couldn't play with Wolves point guard Stephon Marbury anymore. Marbury was signaling to McHale that he would like to stay in Minnesota as well. And then a few months later, Marbury said, actually, never mind, trade me to New Jersey. So the Wolves did just that. And that was the penultimate straw for McHale. He wanted out, but something was keeping him there. And that thing was that in the summer of 1999, the Timberwolves' luck started to turn around a little bit. In the Stephon Marbury trade, the Wolves got a point guard in return named Terrell Brandon. He's a 2-time All-Star from when he was a Cleveland Cavalier in the mid-90s. He re-signed with the Wolves in the offseason after testing free agency. He got a 6-year, $58 million deal. Joe Smith, former number 1 overall pick, who had played for the Warriors, the 76ers, and then in the shortened season, the Timberwolves, he re-signed for just $2.1 million. His stock is pretty low right now, but that's still a shockingly low number for Joe Smith. I'm not going to spoil why, but there is a crazy reason that he re-signed in Minnesota. But Smith is a center. He's got some pedigree. He's still got that former number 1 overall pick shine. He says the lack of stability in his playing situation, new coach, PJ Carlesimo, and then a trade to Philadelphia from Golden State is the reason why he has not been very good for the last couple of years. But now that he has a consistent home and coach and teammates, he's going to be even better. He did average about 14 points, 8 rebounds for the Wolves, started most of their games in 99. Laid an egg in the playoffs, 7.5 points per game on under 30% shooting. But he's back and he's ready to move past that stinker of a playoff loss to the Spurs. And that's got Kevin McHale feeling a little bit more optimistic and ready to stay in his role there in Minnesota. As Flip Saunders said, quote, "When you have guys who want to be here, they're bound to be more effective." Gugliotta and Marbury, they're great players, but if they didn't want to be in Minnesota, they weren't going to give it their all. They believe that Terrell Brandon and Joe Smith will. Now, Joe Smith may be a little hampered by a broken foot that will be healed by the time the season begins, but those guys are hoping to build off of the good things that happened in a season that was a little bit of a step back from the year before. In 1999, they were 17th in offense, 11th in defense, 25-25 record. They were 45-37 in 98. So it's not like it's a huge step back in that sense, but it's really not ideal that they lost their second best forward and their starting point guard in the span of a couple months. And they still have their best forward, though. That's Kevin Garnett, 2-time All-Star, who averaged 21 points, 10.5 rebounds, 4.5 assists, 3.5 stocks. God, this guy's good. Plays some small forwards, some power forwards, some center. He's really versatile, but soon he will be exclusively a big for the Timberwolves. And by the way, shoots, for a 6'11 guy, shoots very few shots at the rim. But Kevin Garnett is actually a major cause of the lockout in 1998, because in 97, he turned down a $103 million contract extension with the Wolves, eventually agreed to $126 million over 6 years. That's $21 million a year on average. Glenn Taylor, the owner of the Timberwolves, he bought the Timberwolves in 94 for under $90 million. So just for Garnett, he paid about 1.5 times what he paid for the entire team 3 years beforehand. So the owners didn't like the precedent that sent. A whole bunch of stuff happened. The 99 season was 50 games instead of 82. The owners got a lot of concessions in the 99 CBA. Back to the Wolves. The Wolves have some names outside of Garnett, Terrell Brandon, and Joe Smith. Most of them aren't super sexy. You got Anthony Peeler. He actually came over from the Vancouver Grizzlies, feuded with Brian Hill for pulling him out of games too quickly for his liking. Feuded a little bit with Stu Jackson for signing too many shooting guards. Eventually, he got his wish to be traded, granted, and was traded to the Timberwolves. He's a very streaky shooter. In his first 30 games in Minnesota after the trade in the 98 season, he was 45% from three. And in the 28 games that he played in 1999, he shot 30% from three. So he currently very boom or bust. Last year it was bust. Maybe this year it'll be boom. Who's to say? He did struggle with some left knee and calf stuff the 99 season, but he seems to be healthy going into the year. There's Sam Mitchell. He's one of the great Timberwolves of all time. Getting up there in age. He'll be 36 this season, but played all 50 games in 99, put up about 11 points a game. Their starting center is a guy named Dean Garrett. He's not a very productive player on the offensive end, but that really is more of a Joe Smith and Kevin Garnett responsibility. And by the way, the trio of Garnett, Smith, and Garrett started 33 games together out of 50. So a lot of the time, they're playing three guys who could potentially be a center, although Garnett's still kind of getting there at this point in his career. Now, their second highest, how do I say this? Smith, Garrett, and Garnett, that is the three-man lineup that had the second most minutes, just a hair behind first place with 551 minutes played together. It is a negative lineup, so it may not surprise you to learn that the Wolves are going to try to go another direction at center. That direction is east to Slovenia. Who wrote this? I got to fire my writers. The Wolves brought over their draft and stash Slovenian center Rašo Nesterović late in the season from Virtus Bologna. They want him to be their starter, so that's bad news if your name is Dean Garrett. Now, Nesterović was a late season addition in the 99 season, but he's kind of like adding a free agent or a draft pick over the summer. He only played 5 games for the Wolves in 99 in total. A couple other additions. William Avery from Duke. He was their 14th pick in the draft. He's a point guard. Got in some hot water with Coach K when he decided to leave Duke. It was a time that was really inconvenient for Coach K. He wanted Avery to come back for his junior year. So K calls up William Avery's mom and is like, your son is going to fuck up my program. I said some more stuff, lied to her, said that William Avery was only going to be a second-round pick. She was like, I see the mock drafts in the paper. He's a lottery pick. So that whole situation left a bad taste in her mouth and in William Avery's mouth. So he's not excommunicated from Duke or anything, but he's not really a big part of the Duke brotherhood, as they say. But William Avery would fight to be Terrell Brandon's backup. He's going to have to beat out the other backup, Bobby Jackson, for that honor. They also drafted Wally Szczerbiak with the 6th pick. He is a lights-out three-point shooter who they're really going to depend on, along with a return to form for Anthony Peeler, to hit some threes. Their only player acquisitions were through the draft. They mostly just re-signed players. The only other player of note that I haven't really mentioned is Malik Sealy. He was a swingman who showed while he was with the Clippers, so take this with a grain of salt if you'd like. But he showed that he could score a little bit if he needed to. I think the Wolves are going to need it because there's a huge load on both ends of the court that falls on the shoulders of Kevin Garnett. Sports Illustrated posits that for this team to be successful, Joe Smith is going to have to be the leading rebounder. Wally Szczerbiak, Terrell Brandon, and Anthony Peeler are going to have to hit threes. But one thing in their favor that I alluded to earlier, the chemistry on this team is absolutely off the charts. Everybody on this team is bought in fully. And in all likelihood, that's going to lead to success. So the Wolves over-under is set at 43.5. It's middle of the pack. Wolf pack, huh? We'll see how they do. I do have a couple of Wolves games, including one that is absolutely incredible. So I can't wait to get to that one when we do. The Houston Rockets. I actually do not have anything for the Houston Rockets. So we're going to move on to the Utah Jazz. I'm just kidding. I'm feeling a little silly tonight. I don't know if you can tell. The Rockets have made a major transformation from the 1999 season, but they're still expected to be pretty good. They are coached by Rudy Tomjanovich, as they have been since 1992. One of the best coaches in the league and a 2-time champion. Also a 5-time All-Star for the San Diego and the Houston Rockets. So although he's from Michigan, this guy is the Houston Rockets. In 1999, the Rockets went 31-19. They were 5th in offense, 15th in defense. And there's a couple big stories from the offseason for the Rockets. The first one is that they traded for Steve Francis. He forced his way to Houston from Vancouver after being drafted 2nd overall. Francis says that his main role on the team is defense and distribution because Charles Barkley and Hakeem Olajuwon are going to shoulder the offensive load. Now, Barkley's going to be 36. Olajuwon's going to be 37. But last season, Barkley had 16 points and 12 rebounds a game. Olajuwon had 19 points, 10 rebounds. But hearing Francis say, defense and distribution, that's my job, that made Rudy Tomjanovich pretty happy to hear. Francis is not considered to be a fantastic defender, although he did average 3 steals a game, a little under that, in his 1 year in college at Maryland. He's a willing passer. He's pretty adamant about becoming a point guard, even though he was a shooting guard at Maryland. So that's going to be a slight adjustment for him. Thankfully, he does have 2 great offensive players to help make that transition a little easier for him. But the man likes to shoot the ball, so we'll see if the angel or the devil on his shoulder wins out during his rookie season. Then the other big story, as we talked about in the last episode in the Blazers section, the Rockets traded away Scottie Pippen, who is obviously a great player. Not an amazing Rocket, though, because of his constant beefing with Charles Barkley. The two did not mesh with each other on or off the court, so it was time for Pippen to go. Here is what Scottie Pippen had to say about Charles Barkley. So this is from an ESPN story while Pippen was still trying to get to the Lakers, not the Blazers. He says, quote, "I probably should have listened to Michael Jordan a year ago when he said that Charles will never win a championship because he doesn't show any dedication. He's a very selfish guy. He doesn't show the desire to want to win. That's my reason for wanting to get away from playing with him, because he just doesn't show the dedication." And so when Chuck wanted an apology, because he actually took a pay cut to facilitate the trade that landed Pippen in Houston. About Chuck wanting an apology, Pippen said, "I wouldn't give Charles Barkley an apology at gunpoint. If anything, he owes me an apology for getting me to come and play with his fat butt." His fat butt? Come on. But the Rockets actually got a ton of players from Portland in exchange for Pippen. Stacey Augmon, they waived him. He actually went back to the Blazers a few days later. Kelvin Cato, he'll log some center minutes this year, so will Carlos Rogers. Ed Gray, his NBA career's over. Brian Shaw, Rockets waived him. Now, the big prize in the Pippen deal for Houston was this guy named Walt Williams. He's a small forward who will slot right into the Pippen spot. He's going to be 29 years old this season. He can shoot the three. 9 points per game for the Blazers last season, but early in his career, he was a nice scorer for the Sacramento Kings. 99, though, was his first season playing on like a real contender in Portland, so we'll see how he does in Houston, who's still operating as a team who thinks that they can make a deep playoff run. They want to squeeze every little bit of life out of Charles Barkley and Hakeem Olajuwon that they can. By the way, if you don't know anything about those guys, Barkley, 1993 MVP, played 8 years for the Sixers, 4 years for the Suns, lost in the finals in 93 to the Chicago Bulls, starting his fourth season in Houston. Great scorer, incredible rebounder for a 6'6" power forward. That's undersized, often called fat, kind of unfortunate. He played at Auburn. Hakeem Olajuwon played at University of Houston. He's a center, 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, 2-time Finals MVP in 94 and 95. So on and so forth. They are two of the greatest basketball players ever. I personally am not somebody who really cares about ranking players. I don't like debating people, and I don't feel like I personally have a good enough grasp on all of NBA history to do it properly anyway. Somebody that I know does have a very good grasp on all of NBA history is Aaron from Hoops Temple. I trust his opinions very much. I will outsource anything that has to do with player rankings to him because he puts a lot of time and thought into his player rankings. As of his most recent all-time ranking, he has Hakeem Olajuwon 13th all-time and Barkley 24th. So, two of the absolute greatest basketball players there have ever been. Olajuwon is still one of the best centers in the NBA, even at age 36, but he was completely dominated by Shaq in the playoffs. The Rockets lost in 4 in a best-of-5 first-round series to the Lakers. Shaq had 29.5 points per game, 10 rebounds, 4 blocks per game in that series, and Olajuwon only averaged 13 points and 7 rebounds and only blocked 3 total shots in those 4 games. Shaq actually blocked Olajuwon 7 times in that series. Olajuwon was also blocked by Kobe and Robert Horry twice as well. So Father Time may be making his way toward Hakeem Olajuwon at this point. But finishing out the starting lineup is the Rockets' new free agent acquisition, Shandon Anderson, who came over from the Utah Jazz, took less money from the Rockets because he didn't want to live in Utah anymore. We'll talk about him more in that section, but he is described as a rugged perimeter defender and skilled post-up player at the shooting guard position. So especially with the Rockets' middling defense last year, they are going to welcome a great wing defender to replace Michael Dickerson, who went over to Vancouver in the Steve Francis deal. So with the addition of a non-shooting point guard in Steve Francis into the fold with Olajuwon, who does not shoot threes, and Barkley, who should shoot fewer threes, it's going to be a little hard to work with spacing-wise, but Rudy Tomjanovich says that they're going to attempt to open the floor up a little more, have Barkley and Olajuwon float away from the basket a little bit to allow Steve Francis and Shandon Anderson to drive to the rim. Olajuwon can shoot a mid-range jumper, so that's not going to be too hard for him. And he's going to be 37, so I'm sure he'd welcome a shift out kind of closer to the perimeter. Now, Barkley and Olajuwon are still going to post up whenever possible, but the lane has got to open up for this team to be successful. Walt Williams is a great three-point shooter, so that's going to help. He can drive inside as well. So there's some optionality out there on the wing, which is nice. So the team is certainly more athletic now than it was in 99, despite Chuck and Hakeem getting a year older, but it's all going to come down to health for Chuck and Hakeem, and then, how Steve Francis acclimates to the league, because rookie point guards can be really tricky to work with. Point guards and centers, by traditional NBA wisdom, are the positions that take the longest to develop. And so with there being such a massive change in Houston, getting older and younger at the same time in a way, they are not thought of as being like a title contender. But their over-under win total is set at 44.5 in the preseason. And honestly, they pivoted away from Scottie Pippen about as well as they could have hoped. They got the number 2 pick as well without having to absolutely suck the year before. But the New York Times says outside of their starting lineup, they have absolutely no depth, which may be true because, you know what? I've not even mentioned most of the other players on this team. Some other rotation players are going to be Coutinho Mobley. He just finished up his rookie season. Started 3/4 of the Rockets games at point guard as a rookie. He will be coming off the bench for Steve Francis. Kind of unfair because he was all rookie last year, but that is just the way it goes. Coutinho Mobley was a second rounder and Francis was the number 2 pick. They are bringing in their rookie first rounder, a guy named Kenny Thomas. He'll come off the bench at power forward. He's from the University of New Mexico. Got another forward named Matt Bullard. So the losses of Michael Dickerson and Othella Harrington in the trade with the Grizzlies are big losses, but if Francis does his job, it's going to be worth it. Is Francis going to do his job? You know, honestly, it's impossible for us to know, so you are going to have to listen to the podcast. Unfortunately, there's no way for us to see into the future here, so you know we'll find out together. Be sure to listen to this podcast that you already listened to find out. Moving on to the Utah Jazz, they're coached by Jerry Sloan. They have been since 1989. They're fresh off of 2 NBA Finals losses to the Chicago Bulls in 97 and 98. In 99, they were 3rd in offense, 7th in defense, 37-13 record. That's tied with the Spurs for the best record in the league in 99. Lost in the second round to the Portland Trailblazers in 6 games after barely holding off the Kings in the first round. They won their final 2 games of that series by a grand total of 8 points. John Stockton hit a pull-up game winner in Game 4 with 0.7 of a second remaining that kept them from being upset by the Kings in that best-of-5 series. Now, for the most part, the Jazz are going to run it back, but as we mentioned already, they lost Shandon Anderson in free agency to the Houston Rockets. He said that he didn't want to be a sideshow in the Stockton and Malone show anymore. He wants a larger role, wants to play at a faster pace, also just does not want to live in Salt Lake City. And Houston could offer him the starting spot with Scottie Pippen and Michael Dickerson out of the picture. Spoiler alert, he is going to start all 82 games for the Rockets and play a ton of minutes, so he kind of got what he wanted there. But the Jazz really wanted to re-sign him, and you know they felt that he was really important to what they were going to do in the upcoming season, and he was one of their youngest rotation players. And so actually when it became clear to them that they weren't going to retain Shandon Anderson, Utah tried to sign and trade him to the Pacers, and then they were going to trade one of their backup point guards, either Howard Eisley or Jacques Vaughn, to the Toronto Raptors in exchange for Doug Christie. But Anderson just said, you know, I'm actually going to just go to Houston instead. So they missed out on that opportunity. But they did re-sign Karl Malone, great basketball player. I don't really want to talk glowingly about him longer than I absolutely have to. MVP in 97 and 99. Also a rapist and a pedophile, by the way. They also re-signed John Stockton, who is a weirdo in his own right, but at least is not a rapist and a pedophile. The Jazz's 36 and 37-year-old stars are back in the building. And outside of a decreased minute load for Stockton, they really haven't shown that many signs of slowing down just yet. Malone averaged 24 points, 9.5 rebounds. Stockton had 11 points and 7.5 assists per game. On a per 100 possession basis, Stockton has been like exactly the same production-wise for like 11 seasons in a row. And then Malone is still Malone as well. Malone, by the way, he strained his back during training camp. He's not going to miss any time at the beginning of the season, but if there is a fall off for Malone, that would be why. So outside of those guys, who else is on this team? Jeff Hornacek. He has announced that he's most likely going to retire after this season. He's still playing really well, but he's going to be 36. Says he may come back for another season if he thinks that they can win a championship. But a running theme for the Jazz is that they've thought it's their year for like the last 12 years in a row, and they just keep getting the rug pulled out from beneath them. They have 2 Greggs at center. Can you believe that? Greg Foster and Greg Ostertag. Ostertag started 48 games for them this season. He's a good rebounder and shot blocker. Greg Foster is his backup. Ostertag averaged over 7 rebounds and about 3 blocks per game in 1999, only 5.7 points per game. They're really trying to push him to get better, but it's just not happening for him. I saw a TikTok today from Nate, from the Hoops Temple podcast. He's on that with Aaron. He read a draft scouting report for Greg Ostertag, and basically it said, okay, he doesn't have a single offensive move he can do. He's slow, he's unmotivated, he gains weight really easily. But that was the starting center for the Utah Jazz in the 1997 finals. So that's kind of interesting. But Ostertag is really being pushed to get better, to the point that the coaching staff and Karl Malone, the word that Sports Illustrated uses is that they abuse him. Now, I do know, I saw a story where Shaq slapped Greg Ostertag during a playoff series, I think. Kind of ruined his confidence after that. Malone has been like egging him on to like punch Shaq during a game or something like that for a couple years now. He says that he'll pay Ostertag's fine if he does it. But it's getting to the point where like Ostertag is getting kind of uncomfortable with the amount of pressure that they're putting on him. So one thing that is clear is that the Jazz need better centers than Foster and Ostertag. So they let Foster walk in free agency, keep Ostertag, and they get Olden Polynice to fill in as starting center. Now, Polynice did not like his role in Sacramento or in Seattle, but so far has really bought into the Utah Jazz. He's diving for loose balls. He's hustling down the court, doing all that stuff in the preseason, especially in comparison to Greg Ostertag. But so they brought in Polynice to start in his place because he's a little more mobile. He's more active. That's kind of what they're looking for. And so Ostertag is about 3 inches and 60 pounds on Polynice, by the way. Ostertag is 7'2", 280. Polynice is 6'11", 220. Brian Russell, he's a 6'7" wing who many will remember from The Last Dance and from Game 6 of the 98 finals. Michael Jordan, I don't know if you've heard of Michael Jordan. He's not in the league at this point. He hit a game winner over Brian Russell in 98. Maybe he pushed off, who knows? But there's a funny story on Wikipedia. I didn't even have to dig for this one. It's right there on Wikipedia. But in Jordan's Hall of Fame induction speech, when Jordan retired from basketball for the first time, he says, I never intended to come back and play, but I ran into Brian Russell in public. And Russell, who was a second-round pick in 1993, comes up to Jordan and he's like, "Why'd you quit? You know I could guard you." And so Jordan is like, "Okay, from this day forward, if I ever see you in shorts, I'm coming at you." And wound up winning his 6th championship with Russell guarding him in the clutch. So that's kind of funny. But so I didn't really do it in any order, but that is the starting 5 of the Utah Jazz. John Stockton, Jeff Hornacek, Brian Russell, Karl Malone, and Olden Polynice. Expect a healthy dose of Greg Ostertag off the bench. Also a guy that I mentioned earlier, Howard Isley, Stockton's backup. He was a second rounder in 1994 out of Boston College. Going back to Game 6 in 98, when the Bulls beat the Jazz by a single point because of Jordan's shot over Brian Russell, Howard Isley actually hit a three-pointer, I think it was in the first half, that he got off in time, but it was waved off incorrectly because there was no instant replay for referees. So that certainly changed the course of how we think about things. But so the Jazz rotation is going to be pretty top heavy. The Jazz in the playoffs in 99, they went 11 deep, which is crazy because nobody does that anymore. The Spurs, who won the title, of course, and we'll talk about in a minute, I'm going to talk about 10 guys with them, but they only really played 8 guys. And so the Jazz see that as something to emulate. They want to tighten up the rotation and, as per usual, have Stockton and Malone each play 1 million minutes. But the loss of Shandon Anderson to the Rockets is going to wind up being pretty significant to Utah because the Jazz were, before they knew that he was going to leave and tried to sign and trade him, they were expecting him this year to be the starter at shooting guard over Jeff Hornacek. So they're going to have to try to get a contribution out of their first-round pick, a guy named Quincy Lewis, who was the top scorer in the Big Ten in 1999. He averaged 23 points per game at the University of Minnesota. They're going to need somebody to step up because, you know, even though it looks like Stockton and Malone are going to keep going forever, you got to plan for the future. That is what Shandon Anderson was supposed to be, but things don't always work out. So they're going to look to Brian Russell and Quincy Lewis to try to fill the Shandon Anderson-shaped hole in the rotation. I'll mention draft, by the way, before I finish it up. So I mentioned Quincy Lewis. He was a first-rounder, pick number 19. They also drafted Andrei Kirilenko with the 24th pick. He's going to stay in Russia for a couple years, but that's something that Jazz fans have to look forward to. Now, Malone, Ostertag, Hornacek, and Isley each sustained kind of minor injuries in the preseason, so we are going to have to see how that affects them in the first couple weeks of the season. One last thing I wanted to mention, there are a few new rules in the NBA this season about hand-checking and post-defense. I'm just going to read a few excerpts directly from a New York Times article here. The most significant change, this rule makes it illegal for defensive players to initiate contact with their hands and arms from the baseline to the foul line. Low post defenders will be able to use their arms to maintain position, but impeding progress in any way will be considered a foul. The idea is to eliminate the chucking and grabbing that slow offenses and prevent scorers from penetrating or getting the ball where they want it on the floor. Quote from Rod Thorne, the NBA's vice president of operations, "We're hoping that the rule gives us a more free-flowing, fluid offensive game." Another rule, a 5-second rule has been added to stop players from isolating themselves on one side of the court and then taking 10 to 15 seconds off the shot clock to back their defender into the post. With only 5 seconds to make their move, players like Charles Barkley and Mark Jackson will either have to make their move quickly or pass the ball. And then this is under a header that says who will be affected. The Knicks, Miami, and Utah, who have forged part of their images on hard physical play, will probably have the hardest time adjusting. Players like Allen Iverson, Allen Houston, and Reggie Miller should have more room to create scoring opportunities since they won't be bouncing off defenders like pinballs anymore. So that is from the New York Times, but the NBA.com Jazz preview says the rule about post defense is going to make things even easier for Karl Malone to score in the post. So, there's some differing opinions there. In the second week of this podcast, there is going to be a Utah Jazz game, though. So we're going to be able to see firsthand if Karl Malone is going to be helped or hindered by these new rules. But the main thing to watch out for with this team is minutes and age. They want to shorten the rotation, and their guys are getting pretty old. Malone's going to be 36, Hornacek 36, Stockton will be 37. The Jazz want to increase their minutes even. Will they be able to get the job done? Are they going to finally break through in 2000 and win a title? Or, is one of the younger teams in the West going to get the best of them on the way? So the Jazz are tied for the fourth best championship odds. Their over-under is set at 49.5. They're still expected to be elite, as they have been since 1988. I looked it up. They've made the playoffs every season since 1984. That is 16 seasons in a row. Is that streak going to be snapped this season? Who's to say? Let's find out. Last but not least, actually the opposite. Last but most, the defending champions, the San Antonio Spurs. They defeated the Timberwolves in the first round, swept the Lakers in the second round, swept the Blazers in the conference finals, beat the New York Knicks, sans Patrick Ewing, in 5 games in the NBA Finals. Won Game 5 when Latrell Sprewell of the Knicks missed what could have been a game-winning shot. Spurs played great defense on the last shot. I actually couldn't tell when I watched it if Sprewell actually got the shot off in time, but regardless, he missed. They are coached by Greg Popovich. It will be his 4th season in that role. He had, of course, taken over midseason for Bob Hill in 97, while their star center, the Admiral David Robinson, was out with a back injury. Pop led the Spurs to a 20-62 record, and they jumped up to number 1 to draft Tim Duncan to pair him with Robinson. Now, Pop had been an assistant coach for the Spurs for 4 seasons in the late 80s and early 90s, and then before he named himself head coach, he was the vice president and general manager of the Spurs. He's actually still the president to this day, but in 99, he's still VP and GM. In 99, they were 11th in offense, 1st in defense, and that is no surprise that they were the best defense in the league because they're anchored by 2 of the best big men in the game, who I've already mentioned, David Robinson and Tim Duncan. I actually almost named this show Tim Dynasty because I love Tim Duncan so much. Either way, whether it's Tim Dynasty or Rim Dynasty, it is a play on the Kim Dynasty in North Korea. North Korea is another one of my, I guess you could call it a special interest. Neck and neck with the Vancouver Grizzlies, if you can believe that. My fiance calls me a new kind of guy. But anyway, David Robinson is getting a little older, but is still a premier center, has graciously ceded some shots and minutes and spotlight to Tim Duncan. Robinson is going to be 34. He's still an all-star caliber player. The only times in his 10-year NBA career that he has not been an all-star were 1997 when he played 6 games due to injury, and then 1999 when nobody was an all-star because there was no all-star game. But Robinson, in his diminished role, still averages 16 points and 10 rebounds, 3.8 stocks, about 32 minutes per game. Played and started in 49 out of the 50 games. One of the greatest players ever. Even though he is getting a little older, we are still going to see him play some extremely high-level basketball throughout this podcast. Now, the other big man, Tim Duncan, We all know about him. Robinson calls Duncan the best thing that ever happened to him. Duncan has just finished up his second season in the league. He averages about 22 points, 11.5 rebounds, 2.5 blocks, shoots a ton of bank shots, all that stuff. As Zach Lowe says in some ad read, came into the league as an MVP candidate. That is true. He was 5th in MVP voting in 98 and 3rd in 99. Won the Finals MVP award as a second-year player. But combined, Duncan and Robinson blocked about 5 shots per game. And in total, the Spurs blocked 8.6% of their opponent's shot attempts, which was best in the league. The other two great shot blocking teams, by the way, were the Raptors and the Heat. But so they had more than just Duncan and Robinson. Those are the major stars of the Spurs. But they also had another great all-time Spur, somebody who was recently photographed having dinner with Victor Wembanyama, actually, Sean Elliott. He is a small forward. His career is kind of up in the air at the moment. It's actually not known whether he'll ever play basketball again because he's just gotten a kidney transplant. His older brother gave him a kidney, which is incredible. He had known about his kidney disease since 1993. It was actually something that prevented him from being traded to the Houston Rockets in 1994. So Elliott had been a Spur his entire career, except for one season, 93-94. He was a Detroit Piston. He was traded there, didn't really mesh well with the team, and the Pistons tried to move him to the Rockets, but they couldn't because he failed a physical. After the season, they just traded him back to the Spurs, who presumably waived the physical, but the Spurs received a $2.7 million medical exception to get a replacement for Elliott. So we're going to see in just a minute what they did with that. The guards for this team, you got Mario Elie at the 2. He was a longtime Houston Rocket. Point guard, Avery Johnson, a.k.a. the Little General, 5'10", kind of a late bloomer, didn't become a full-fledged starter until he was around 27, 28 years old. But he'd been coached by Popovich in San Antonio and in Golden State and was brought back to San Antonio for his third stint, which wound up being for 7 years. And he averaged a little under 10 points, but 7.5 assists for the Spurs in 99, so that's pretty good. And then off the bench, you have Jaren Jackson Sr., who's a streaky shooting guard. Never has played for a team for more than one season until 1999 in San Antonio, and they won the championship. So to the Nets, the Warriors, the Clippers, the Blazers, the Sixers, the Rockets, and the Bullets, all you had to do was re-sign Jaren Jackson, and you would have won a title. But you didn't. The Spurs did. They won it. Another guy, Jerome Kersey. He's kind of a bit player at this point at age 36, but he appeared in most of the playoff and regular season games for the Spurs. He is most known for his 11 years in Portland. Malik Rose, he's a power forward. Steve Kerr, a guard, and Antonio Daniels, another guard. And by the way, cast aside by the Vancouver Grizzlies and then instantly won an NBA title. So between the Spurs and the Grizzlies, I don't really care who won the trade, but Antonio Daniels sure won the trade. But so that's a pretty great group of 10 guys, and they brought every single one of them back, if you can believe it. But they also made a couple key additions, not through the draft, but through free agency. In the draft, the Spurs wound up with the draft rights to Argentine-Italian Emanuel Ginobili, as David Stern said, and then the Croatian Gordon Giracek, neither of whom would come over just yet. We'll have to wait until 2002 to see them. But in free agency, they got a couple guys. There's Terry Porter. He is a fantastic point guard from University of Wisconsin at Stevens Point. If you've never heard of that school, I understand. He played 10 seasons in Portland, 7 as the full-time starter. He was an all-star in 91 and 93. So the Blazers made the finals in 90 and 92. Both times, everybody clearly just saw Terry Porter be really good and were like, oh wow, I forgot how good he is, and then made him an all-star. And then, so he shared a role with Rod Strickland, who's another Blazers point guard starting in 94. As I mentioned, went to the finals in 90 and 92, lost to the Pistons and to the Bulls. He's a little older now. He's 35 or so, coming off a season as the backup point guard for the Miami Heat. But he averaged 10.5 points, 3 rebounds, 3 assists, and a steal in all 50 games for the Miami Heat. And he's considered a fantastic addition. He's a really smart, mature player. He's joining a really smart, mature team in San Antonio. So Terry Porter fits this team like a glove. And then they brought in at forward to replace Sean Elliott, Chucky Brown. He's a 6'7" forward from the Charlotte Hornets. signing Chucky Brown was not the Spurs' intention whatsoever entering free agency. They tendered offers to 4 other guys before they wound up with Chucky Brown. The first guy they were after was Shandon Anderson. He went to the Rockets. Second was Detlef Schrempf. He went to the Portland Trailblazers. Lamond Murray. He actually agreed to come to the Spurs and then reneged on that and was instead signed and traded by the Clippers to the Cleveland Cavaliers. And then another Clippers player, Tyrone Nesby, he was a restricted free agent. The Clippers matched the offer. So that is 4 good small forward options that just did not pan out for the Spurs. And if you think about it, that is really odd for a defending champion to not have a bunch of guys clamoring to join them. But I don't know, that's kind of interesting to me. So they got Chucky Brown. They added Felton Spencer. He is a backup center. Got Samaki Walker from the Dallas Mavericks. He averaged about 6.5 points, 5 rebounds for his career. There's 2 big men out of Louisville, Felton Spencer and Samaki Walker. So everybody returned. Terry Porter's going to be first off the bench at point guard. And we'll follow this throughout the season. The absence of Sean Elliott is something that the Spurs are not going to struggle throughout the season, but it's something because the Spurs are really good this season, as you might imagine. But they are going to have to use some amalgam of like Chucky Brown, Jaren Jackson, Malik Rose, Mario Elie, and actually Tim Duncan at the 3. He has played small forward at times in the first couple years of his career, oddly enough. But they're going to have to use a combo of all those guys to fill the Elliott-sized hole in the roster. And all of that is going to depend on the matchup. So, look for, again, some strategery on Coach Pop's part there. The Spurs are 3rd in championship odds behind the Blazers and Lakers to repeat. Their over-under win total is 54.5, second only to the Blazers. It's really hard to repeat as champions in the NBA, but with Tim Duncan only in his 2nd year and already having a Finals MVP, it's not far-fetched to think that they could repeat as champions. They've either stayed the same or gotten better, depending on how you look at adding Terry Porter, losing Sean Elliott. But the Lakers and the Blazers and the Suns and the Kings and the Sonics and the Rockets and the Jazz all would love to be the ones to end what appears to be a burgeoning San Antonio Spurs dynasty. So that's 7 teams that I mentioned. There's a lot of really good teams in the West this year. You or I could talk yourself or myself into any one of those teams that I just mentioned, plus the Spurs getting home court advantage in the playoffs this season. And Minnesota's not bad either. It's not really their year this year, I would say. But one thing to look out for that will be resolved actually by the first regular season episode of this show is that there's a referendum in Bexar County, Texas. San Antonio is the county seat of Bexar County for a tax increase that would fund a new stadium for the Spurs. If the referendum fails, the Spurs are going to relocate from San Antonio. Tim Duncan has already said if the team relocates, he is going to leave in free agency in 2000 because he doesn't want to be at the mercy of wherever the team relocates to determine where he's going to play. So he's already said if the team moves, he's getting out. So I'll leave you in suspense about what happens there. Surely you could not guess what's going to happen with this referendum based on what you know about the future. But that about wraps up the Spurs section and the Midwest preview. That's all 14 teams in the Western Conference previewed. The next episode will be one of the Eastern Conference divisions, the Central Division. That is the Pacers, Hawks, Pistons, Bucks, Hornets, Raptors, Cavaliers, and Bulls. That is the one division that has 8 teams within it. So, it'll either be a very long episode or I'll shorten the previews for each team. But maybe it'll just be a longer episode. I don't know. I like going into adequate depth for each of these teams. And I'm looking and holy shit, this episode is going to be long. Did not mean for it to be that long, so I apologize. Thank you for listening. Regardless, that does it for this episode. Be sure to follow me on social media. All the platforms are in the description of this episode. Follow the show on your preferred podcast platform if you'd like. I appreciate you listening. And next episode, we'll talk about the Central Division. All right, have a good one.